The fluorescent lights of Wilson High School buzzed overhead as 17-year-old David Chen slid into his seat in the back row of chemistry class. His eyelids felt like they were made of concrete. He blinked hard, trying to focus on the periodic table hanging on the wall, but the symbols blurred together into meaningless shapes. Mrs. Patterson was already writing equations on the whiteboard, her voice a distant hum in his exhausted mind. David pulled out his notebook and tried to copy what she was writing, but his hand moved slowly like it belonged to someone else. The words on the page looked crooked and strange. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours. Again. Last night at the quick-stop convenience store had been particularly brutal. A water pipe had burst in the back room around 2 in the morning, and he'd spent an hour mopping up the mess with his manager, Raymond. By the time he'd restocked the coolers and cleaned up after the late-night crowd, dawn was already breaking through the store windows. David had clocked out at 6, taken the bus home, and found his mother already awake at the sewing machine in their tiny living room. She worked from home now, taking in alterations and repairs for a local dry cleaner. The whir of her machine was the soundtrack of his childhood, a constant reminder of how hard she worked to keep them afloat. "Did you eat?" she'd asked without looking up from the hem she was pinning. "I'll grab something at school," he'd lied. The truth was he'd spent his meal allowance on the electric bill last week. Now sitting in chemistry class with his stomach growling and his eyes burning, David wondered how much longer he could keep this up. It had been 8 months since he'd started working nights, 8 months since his father's funeral, since they'd discovered the mountain of medical debt left behind, since his mother's face had taken on that permanent look of worry that made her seem 10 years older. "David? David Chen?" Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through his fog. He jerked his head up to find the entire class staring at him. "Yes, ma'am? I asked if you could explain the difference between exothermic and endothermic reactions." David's mind went blank. He knew this. He'd studied it last week, but the information felt locked behind a wall of exhaustion he couldn't climb over. It's when one releases heat and the other absorbs heat," Mrs. Patterson finished for him, her expression softening. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," David said quickly. "Just didn't sleep well." The teacher held his gaze for a moment longer than comfortable before turning back to the board. David sank lower in his seat, feeling the heat of embarrassment crawl up his neck. This wasn't who he was supposed to be. Before his father got sick, David had been a straight-A student, the kid teachers pointed to as an example. He dreamed of studying engineering at a university, maybe even getting out of their small town and seeing what else the world had to offer. Now those dreams felt like they belonged to a different person entirely. The bell rang, and David gathered his things slowly, every movement requiring conscious effort. As he shuffled toward the door, Mrs. Patterson called out to him, "David, can you stay behind for a minute?" His heart sank. He couldn't afford to be late to his next class. He was already walking on thin ice with attendance. "I've noticed you've been struggling lately," Mrs. Patterson said once the classroom had emptied. She perched on the edge of her desk, her expression kind but concerned. "Your grades have dropped significantly this semester. You used to be one of my best students. I know. I'm sorry. I'll do better. Is everything okay at home? Is there something going on that I should know about?" David wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to explain that he worked 40 hours a week while carrying a full course load, that he came to school on 2 or 3 hours of sleep most days, that he sometimes fell asleep standing up during his shift at the quick stop, jerking awake when the door chime rang. But shame kept his mouth closed. What would she think of him? What would his classmates say if they knew? They'd probably pity him, or worse, they'd treat him differently. He couldn't bear the thought of being the charity case of Wilson High. "Everything's fine," he said, forcing what he hoped was a convincing smile. "I've just been staying up too late playing video games. You know how it is." Mrs. Patterson didn't look convinced, but she nodded slowly. "Well, we have a big exam coming up next week. I'd hate to see you fail it. Maybe you could come in during lunch for some extra review." "I'll try," David said, knowing he wouldn't. Lunch period was when he caught precious minutes of sleep in the library, his head down on a table in the back corner where nobody bothered him. He left the classroom and made his way through the crowded hallway, invisible among the sea of students laughing and chatting about weekend plans and soccer games and all the normal things teenagers worried about. David couldn't remember the last time he'd felt normal. His best friend Ben caught up with him at his locker. Dude, you look terrible. Are you getting sick? Just tired, David said, exchanging his chemistry textbook for his history folder. You're always tired lately. Want to grab burgers after school? My treat. David's stomach twisted with hunger at the thought, but he shook his head. Can't, got stuff to do. You always have stuff to do. Come on, man. When's the last time we hung out? Soon, David promised, even though he had no idea when that would be. Between school and work, there was no time for anything else. No time for friends, no time for fun, no time to just be 17. Ben looked like he wanted to say more, but the warning bell rang. All right, whatever. But seriously, you're worrying me. As David headed to his next class, he felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing. He had 7 more hours of school ahead of him. Then he'd go home for a few hours, try to study, maybe sleep for 90 minutes if he was lucky, and then it would be time to put on his quick-stop uniform and do it all over again. The worst part wasn't even the tiredness. It was the growing feeling that he was failing at everything. Failing his classes, failing his mother who sacrificed so much, failing the memory of his father, who'd always believed David would be the one to break their family out of the cycle of just barely getting by. He slid into his desk in history class and pulled out a notebook, preparing himself for another hour of fighting to stay awake, to stay present, to keep pretending that everything was fine when really, he was drowning. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late October. During the chemistry exam David had been dreading for weeks. He'd tried to prepare for it. Really, he had. Between customers at the Quick Stop, he'd reviewed his notes, making flashcards on the back of receipt paper. During his 15-minute breaks, he'd huddled in the stockroom with his textbook, trying to force formulas into his exhausted brain. But studying in 5-minute increments while also running a cash register wasn't the same as real focused preparation. The night before the exam, David had worked his usual shift. It had been busier than normal, a steady stream of customers buying lottery tickets and energy drinks and cigarettes. By the time he'd cleaned the coffee station and restocked the shelves, it was already 6:15 in the morning. He'd missed his bus and had to wait 30 minutes for the next one. When he finally walked through the doors of Wilson High at 7:45, he had exactly 15 minutes before the exam started. No time to review. No time to even splash cold water on his face in the bathroom. He went straight to Mrs. Patterson's classroom and took his seat, his heart pounding with anxiety. The exam was 4 pages long. David stared at the first question, reading it 3 times before the words started to make sense. His hand shook slightly as he wrote his name at the top of the page. The classroom was silent except for the scratch of pencils on paper and the tick of the wall clock. He made it through the first page. The questions were hard but not impossible. On the second page, his vision started to blur. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, tried to focus. The symbols and numbers seemed to shift and dance on the paper. Halfway through the third page, David's head began to nod. He caught himself, jerked upright, looked around to see if anyone had noticed. Mrs. Patterson was reading at her desk. His classmates were all bent over their exams, completely absorbed. David took a deep breath and forced himself to read the next question. It was about chemical equilibrium. He knew this. He'd studied this. But when he tried to recall the information, his mind was just empty, like trying to find something in a room with no lights. His eyelids grew heavier. Just for a second, he thought, I'll just close my eyes for 1 second. The next thing David knew, someone was shaking his shoulder. He jolted awake, disoriented, his cheek wet from where it had been pressed against his exam paper. Mrs. Patterson was standing beside his desk, her expression a mixture of concern and disappointment. David, the period is over. Everyone else has left. He looked around the empty classroom, his heart plummeting. The clock on the wall showed that 20 minutes had passed since the bell. He'd slept through the end of the exam and hadn't even heard his classmates leaving. I'm so sorry, he stammered, sitting up straight. His neck ached from the awkward angle. I didn't mean to. Come with me, Mrs. Patterson said quietly. We need to talk to the counselor. The walk to the guidance office felt like a death march. Mrs. Patterson didn't say anything, and David couldn't bring himself to break the silence. What was there to say? That he'd fallen asleep during one of the most important exams of the semester? That he was failing the class he used to love most? Mrs. Henderson, the school counselor, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that made students feel safe opening up to her. But David had never been to her office before, and sitting in the chair across from her desk made him feel like he'd committed some terrible crime. "David, Mrs. Patterson is worried about you," Mrs. Henderson began gently. "She tells me this isn't the first time you've fallen asleep in class, and your grades have dropped significantly over the past few months. Can you help us understand what's going on?" David stared at his hands. The words felt stuck in his throat, too heavy to lift out. "Is there something happening at home? Are you safe there?" "Yes," David said quickly. "It's not that. It's just what?" And suddenly, like a dam breaking, everything poured out. The medical debt. His mother's 3 jobs becoming 2, then one that barely paid enough. The night shifts at Quick Stop. The impossible juggling act of trying to be a student by day and a provider by night. The exhaustion that had become his constant companion. The shame of watching his dreams slip further away with each passing week. Mrs. Patterson handed him a tissue at some point. David hadn't even realized he was crying. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Mrs. Henderson asked softly. "There are resources available. Programs that could help." "Because I didn't want anyone to know," David admitted, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want to be the kid everyone felt sorry for. I thought I could handle it. I thought if I just worked hard enough I could make it work." That evening, David's best friend Ben showed up at the Quick Stop around midnight. David was restocking the candy aisle when he heard the door chime and looked up to see Ben walking in, his expression somewhere between shocked and hurt. "So this is where you've been," Ben said. "Every night when you said you were busy. You're here." David's face burned with embarrassment. "How did you know?" "My cousin mentioned seeing you here." I didn't believe him. Ben looked around the store, taking in David's uniform, the circles under his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's embarrassing," David said quietly. "Everyone else is worried about prom dates and college applications. I'm worried about whether we can afford to keep the lights on. That's not embarrassing. That's life being unfair." Ben grabbed a bag of chips from the shelf.
"How long have you been doing this?"
8 months. 8 months, Ben repeated, shaking his head. "And I had no idea. Some best friend I am. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anyone to know. But by the next day, everyone knew. Not the whole school, thankfully, but enough people that David felt the weight of their knowing stares in the hallway. Ben had told a few people who'd told a few more people, and suddenly David was the subject of whispered conversations and pitying glances. On Thursday afternoon, he found a gift card to the cafeteria stuffed in his locker with an unsigned note that said, "For lunch. You deserve it." It made him want to cry and scream at the same time. That night, David came home to find his mother still awake at midnight, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and tears on her cheeks. "Mrs. Henderson called me today," she said. "She told me about the exam, about how tired you are." David set down his backpack, guilt washing over him in waves. "I'm sorry, Mom, I'm trying. I really am. You shouldn't have to try this hard. You're 17 years old. You should be studying and spending time with friends, not working 40 hours a week. We need the money, not at the cost of your future." His mother reached across the table and took his hand. "Your father and I, we worked so hard so that you wouldn't have to struggle like we did. And look what's happened. I've put his burden on your shoulders and it's crushing you. It's not your fault, Mom." "Then whose fault is it?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I see you falling asleep on the couch with your books. I hear you leave for work every night. I know you're barely eating. And I've been telling myself that you're strong enough to handle it, that we don't have a choice. But we do have a choice. You could quit that job tomorrow. And then what? How do we pay the bills? We figure it out. We always have." David shook his head. "I can't quit. I can't watch you work yourself to death while I just go to school like nothing's wrong. I can't, Mom." They sat there in the kitchen for a long time, holding hands across the table, both of them crying for different reasons, both of them trapped in an impossible situation with no easy answers. David didn't quit his job. But lying in bed that night after his conversation with his mother, staring at the ceiling while exhaustion pulled at his bones, he made a decision. If he couldn't choose between school and work, then he'd have to find a way to do both. Really do both. Not the half-hearted, barely surviving version he'd been managing for months. He needed a system. The next morning, Saturday, David woke up at 8 o'clock with a strange sense of purpose. His mother was already at the sewing machine, and the smell of coffee filled their small apartment. He poured himself a cup and sat down at the kitchen table with a blank notebook and a pen. At the top of the page, he wrote, "My life in hours." Then he started calculating. 24 hours in a day, 8 hours for his shift at Quick Stop. That left 16 hours, 8 hours for school, including his commute. That left 8 hours. If he slept for 6 hours total, split into 2 3-hour blocks, that gave him 2 hours for everything else. Studying, eating, showering, existing. It looked impossible on paper, but what choice did he have? David drew out a weekly schedule, blocking out every single hour. 6:30 to 9:30 in the morning, sleep after his night shift. 10 to 3 school. 3 to 6:30 library time for serious studying. 6:30 to 9:30 second sleep block. 9:45 leave for work. 10 to 6 work shift. The cycle would repeat over and over 7 days a week. His hand cramped as he wrote, but something shifted inside his chest. For the first time in months, he felt like he had some control. The system wouldn't make things easy, but it would make things possible. On Sunday, David went to the library and stayed for 6 hours straight. He caught up on 3 weeks of chemistry homework. He outlined his history essay. He reorganized all his class notes into a binder system with color-coded tabs. When the library closed at 5, his hand ached from writing, but his backpack was lighter somehow. Monday morning, the new routine began. David set 3 different alarms to make sure he'd wake up after his first sleep block. He laid out his school clothes the night before. He meal prepped on Sunday evening, packing simple sandwiches and fruit into containers so he wouldn't waste time or money on lunch. At school, he started recording lectures on his phone. Mrs. Patterson had agreed to let him do it, and so had his other teachers, once he'd explained his situation. During his bus commute and his breaks at Quick Stop, he'd listen to the recordings, absorbing information during time that used to be wasted. The first week was brutal. His body rebelled against the strict schedule, demanding more sleep, more rest, more of everything he couldn't afford to give it. David's muscles ached. His head pounded. There were moments, usually around 3 in the morning when the store was empty and quiet, where he wondered if he was losing his mind. But he stuck with it. The second week was slightly better. His body started adjusting to the split sleep schedule. The 6 hours of sleep, while not ideal, was better than the 2 or 3 he'd been getting before. He felt more alert in class. His hand stopped shaking when he took notes. David also started using every spare minute at work strategically. When there were no customers, he kept his chemistry flashcards at the register, quizzing himself between transactions. During his 15-minute breaks, instead of scrolling through his phone like he used to, he'd read ahead in his textbooks. His manager, Raymond, noticed the change and started giving him the quieter hours when possible. "You're going places, kid," Raymond said one night, watching David work through calculus problems on scrap paper during a lull. "I can tell." By the 3rd week, something remarkable started to happen. David's latest chemistry quiz came back with a bright red 87% at the top. Not perfect, but compared to the failing grades he'd been getting, it felt like a miracle. His history teacher pulled him aside after class. "Whatever you're doing differently, keep doing it. Your last essay was excellent." The changes were small at first, barely noticeable to anyone but David himself. But he noticed. He noticed that he could stay awake through entire classes now. He noticed that information was actually sticking in his brain instead of sliding off like water on glass. He noticed that when teachers asked questions, he could answer them. One Saturday afternoon at the library, David ran into Helen, one of the top students in his grade. She was sitting up at a table with what looked like half the school's textbooks. "Hey," she said, looking surprised to see him. "I didn't know you came here." "Every weekend," David replied. "You?" "Same, working on the calculus problem sets." "They're killing me." David had finished those problems the day before. "Want some help? I think I figured out the trick to them." Helen's eyes widened. "Really? That would be amazing." They spent the next hour working through the problems together. David discovered that teaching someone else actually helped him understand the concepts better. When he explained why a certain formula worked, he had to think about it more deeply than when he just solved it himself. "You're really good at this," Helen said as she packed up her things. "Have you thought about starting a study group? I know a bunch of people who are struggling with calc." The idea planted itself in David's mind. a study group. A way to help others while reinforcing his own knowledge. A way to turn his struggle into something useful. By the fourth week, David's routine had become second nature. His body had adjusted to the split sleep schedule. He knew exactly which bus to catch and which route to take. He knew that Tuesday nights were slowest at Quick Stop and Friday nights were busiest. He knew that he studied best in the morning, his mind freshest after his first sleep block. His mother noticed the change too. She stopped hovering quite so anxiously when he left for work. She smiled more when he showed her his improving test scores. "I'm proud of you," she said one evening looking up from her sewing. "Not because of your grades, because you didn't give up. You found a way." David started carrying a small notebook everywhere, jotting down things he needed to remember, ideas for better organizing his time, concepts he wanted to review later. The notebook became an extension of his brain, a way to capture thoughts before they slipped away in the fog of exhaustion. He created a chart tracking his grades in each class, watching the lines slowly climb upward week by week. Chemistry went from a 64 to a 73 to an 81. English jumped from a 70 to an 85. Even gym class, which he'd been failing due to exhaustion, started to improve as his energy levels increased. The hardest part wasn't the studying or the work or even the lack of sleep. It was the loneliness. While his classmates spent weekends at movies and parties, David spent them in the library or at Quick Stop. While they stressed about asking someone to homecoming, David stressed about whether he'd studied enough for his physics exam. But slowly, the sacrifice started to feel worth it. Because for the first time since his father had died, David felt like he was moving forward instead of just drowning. He was still tired, still stretched thin, still working harder than any 17-year-old should have to work. But he was surviving. More than that, he was starting to succeed, and that made all the difference. 3 months into his new system, David walked into chemistry class and found Mrs. Patterson handing back the latest exam. His stomach clenched with the familiar anxiety of waiting for a grade. But when she placed his paper face down on his desk with a knowing smile, something in her expression made his heart skip. He flipped it over. 96%. David stared at the number, barely believing it. The highest grade in the class was written in the corner, along with Mrs. Patterson's note. "Incredible improvement. This is the student I knew was in there all along." Something loosened in his chest, something that had been wound tight for months. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. "Nice job, Chen," the girl next to him whispered, glancing at his paper. "Did you study with someone?" "Just figured out a better way to organize my time," David said, which was the understatement of the century. At lunch, instead of sleeping in the library, David had started meeting with a small group of students who struggled with math and science. It had started with just Helen, but word had spread and now 5 or 6 people showed up regularly. They'd claimed a table in the corner of the cafeteria, and David found himself looking forward to these sessions. Teaching others forced him to understand the material at a deeper level. When someone asked why a formula worked a certain way, he couldn't just regurgitate memorized information. He had to truly understand it. And somehow that made everything click into place in his own mind. "You should seriously consider tutoring," Helen said one day as they packed up. "Like, officially. My parents would totally pay you." David had never thought about that. Tutoring meant extra money, but it also meant extra time. Time he didn't have. But that evening at Quick Stop, during a quiet hour around 2 in the morning, he did the math. If he could tutor just 3 students for an hour each per week, that would nearly match what he made working 1 full night shift. And he could do it during his library time, which meant not losing sleep. He mentioned it to Raymond during his break. "You're thinking about cutting back hours?" his manager asked, looking disappointed but not surprised. "Not cutting back completely, just finding a balance." Raymond nodded slowly. "I get it. And honestly, kid, I've been waiting for you to realize you're too smart to be working here forever. If you need to adjust your schedule, we'll figure it out." By mid-January, David was tutoring 6 students regularly. His mother had been skeptical at first, worried about him taking on more responsibility. But when she saw the checks parents were writing, her concerns faded. The extra income meant David could cut his Quick Stop shifts from 5 nights a week to 3. Those 2 extra nights felt like a gift from the universe. David used them to sleep full nights, to study without the constant pressure of an impending shift, to remember what it felt like to be a normal teenager, even if just for a few hours. His grades continued to climb. By February, David had made the honor roll for the first time since his father's death. The certificate came in the mail and his mother cried when she saw it, holding the paper like it was made of gold. "Your father would be so proud," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so proud." But the real turning point came in March during the state mathematics competition. David's calculus teacher, Mr. Foster, had encouraged him to enter, insisting he had the skills to compete. David had been reluctant, unsure if he could spare the time for additional preparation, but something in Mr. Foster's persistence convinced him to try. The competition was held on a Saturday at the State University, a sprawling campus that made David's high school look tiny by comparison. Walking through those halls, surrounded by students from schools all over the state, David felt both intimidated and energized. These were the best math students in their schools, and he was one of them. The test was 3 hours long, filled with problems that made his brain hurt in the best possible way. When time was called, David felt like he'd given everything he had. Whether it was enough, he had no idea. 2 weeks later, Mr. Foster pulled him aside after class, grinning like he'd won the lottery. "You placed third in the state," he said. "Third, David, out of 500 students." David couldn't process the words at first. Third in the state, him? The kid who'd been failing chemistry 6 months ago? The kid who fell asleep during exams and worked night shifts at a convenience store? "There's a ceremony in April," Mr. Foster continued, "and a scholarship. $1,500 toward college. You should be very proud of yourself." That night at Quick Stop, David couldn't stop smiling. Customers probably thought he was crazy, grinning to himself while he rang up their purchases. But he didn't care. He'd worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and finally it was paying off. Raymond noticed his mood. "Good day at school?" "The best," David said, and he told his manager about the competition. "See? I told you that you were going places." Raymond clapped him on the shoulder. "You keep this up. You're not going to need this job much longer." Spring semester brought new challenges and new victories. David's tutoring reputation grew, and suddenly he was turning down students because he didn't have enough time. His teachers started using him as an example, pointing to his transformation as proof that hard work and dedication could overcome any obstacle. What they didn't see was the cost of that transformation. The split sleep schedule had become manageable, but it was still exhausting. David still missed parties and football games. He still felt disconnected from the normal rhythms of teenage life. His relationship with Ben had suffered. They barely talked anymore, their lives moving in different directions. But when David looked at his grade point average steadily climbing toward a 4.0, when he calculated his class ranking and realized he'd jumped from near the bottom to the top 20, when he thought about the scholarship money slowly accumulating and the possibility of college becoming real, instead of just a dream, he knew it was worth it. His mother's business had picked up too. She'd gained new clients through word of mouth, and some weeks she made enough that David could cut another shift at Quick Stop. The financial pressure that had been crushing them began to ease just slightly, just enough that they could breathe. By the end of his junior year, David Chen wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. His system had worked better than he could have imagined. The strict schedule, the strategic studying, the tutoring that reinforced his own learning, it had all come together in a way that transformed his entire life. He'd learned to make every minute count, to turn limitations into opportunities, to find strength he never knew he had. And he was just getting started. Part 5. Senior year began with David Chen standing in the guidance office staring at a piece of paper that felt surreal in his hands. His class rank number 2, his GPA 397, his SAT scores well above the national average. The numbers represented countless hours of sacrifice, but they also represented possibility. "Have you thought about where you want to apply?" Mrs. Henderson asked, watching his face carefully. "I can't afford to think about it," David admitted. "Even with my tutoring money and the scholarship from the math competition, college seems impossible." Mrs. Henderson smiled. "Let me show you something." She pulled up a website on her computer, listing dozens of scholarships specifically for students who'd overcome significant hardships. Full rides to state universities, private scholarships from foundations that supported first-generation college students, programs David had never even known existed. "Your story matters," Mrs. Henderson said. "What you've accomplished while working night shifts and supporting your family." Admissions committees and scholarship boards want to see that kind of determination. David spent the next month writing application essays late at night between customers at Quick Stop. He wrote about his father's death, about the medical debt, about falling asleep during exams and the moment he decided to build a system instead of giving up. The words poured out of him, raw and honest in a way that felt both terrifying and liberating. His teachers wrote recommendation letters that made him tear up when Mrs. Henderson showed them to him. They called him extraordinary, resilient, inspiring, words David had never imagined anyone using to describe him. By October, David had applied to 8 schools and 14 different scholarships. He'd cut his Quick Stop shifts to just 2 nights a week, enough to help his mother with bills but not enough to destroy him. Raymond had been understanding, even proud. "You're doing exactly what you should be doing," his manager told him, "getting yourself out of here and into a better future." But the biggest change came from an unexpected direction. In November, one of David's tutoring students, a sophomore named Chris, asked if he could share David's story with the school newspaper. David had been hesitant, still uncomfortable with attention, but something made him say yes. The article ran in December, just before winter break. It was titled "The Invisible Student: How One Senior Balanced School, Work, and Success." The writer had interviewed David, his teachers, even Raymond from Quick Stop. She'd written about his nightly routine, his split sleep schedule, his determination to help his family while pursuing his education. David had expected embarrassment. What he got instead was overwhelming. On Monday morning, his locker was covered with sticky notes, messages from students he barely knew saying, "You inspire me," and "Thank you for sharing your story," and "You're amazing." Teachers stopped him in the hallway to congratulate him. The principal called him into her office to personally thank him for representing the school so well, but the most meaningful response came from a freshman named Miguel who approached David nervously during lunch. "I read your article," Miguel said quietly. "My mom's sick. I've been thinking about getting a job to help with bills, but I'm scared my grades will tank. Could you maybe talk to me about how you made it work?" David looked at this kid, barely 14, already carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, and saw himself a year ago. He saw the fear and the determination and the desperate hope that somehow things could work out. "Yeah," David said. "I can help you." That conversation led to 3 more, then 5, then 10. Students David had never met were reaching out, sharing their own struggles, asking for advice. He realized his story had given them permission to acknowledge their own hardships, to seek help instead of suffering in silence. David started a mentorship program with Mrs. Henderson's support. Nothing formal, just a lunch group where students who were working or dealing with family challenges could meet, share strategies, and support each other. They called themselves The Grind, and David found himself leading discussions about time management, stress coping, and how to ask for help when you needed it. In February, the acceptance letters started arriving. David was admitted to every school he'd applied to, but the real shock came in the form of a thick envelope from State University, containing not just an acceptance letter, but a full scholarship package. Full tuition, room and board, even a stipend for books and expenses. His mother cried for an hour when he showed her. They sat together at the kitchen table where they'd had so many difficult conversations, but this time the tears were different. These were tears of relief and joy and pride. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Graduation day arrived in May, warm and sunny. David sat in his blue cap and gown, sandwiched between classmates who'd had 4 years of normal high school experiences, while he'd been fighting just to survive. The principal announced that David would be giving the valedictory speech, an honor that had gone to the #1 student in the class, Helen. But she'd insisted he speak instead. "Your story needs to be heard," she'd told him. "You earned this more than anyone." Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, David felt his heart hammering. He'd written and rewritten his speech a dozen times, trying to find the right words. In the end, he'd decided on the truth. "I almost didn't make it to this moment," he began, and the audience went quiet. "A year and a half ago, I was failing. I was working 40 hours a week at a convenience store, trying to help my mom pay bills after my dad passed away. I fell asleep during exams. My grades tanked. I honestly thought about dropping out." He saw his mother in the 3rd row already crying, and it gave him courage to continue. "But I didn't drop out. Instead, I got angry. I got determined. I decided that if I couldn't choose between school and work, I'd have to excel at both. So I created a system. David described his split sleep schedule, his strategic study methods, his use of every spare minute. He talked about the cost of his choices, the loneliness and exhaustion and constant pressure. But he also talked about the rewards, the satisfaction of seeing his grades climb, the joy of helping other students, the moment he'd learned he'd earned a full scholarship. "I'm not telling you this story to brag," David said. "I'm telling you because I know I'm not the only student in this auditorium who's struggling. I know there are others working jobs to support their families, others dealing with challenges their classmates can't see. And I want you to know that you're not alone, that it's possible to overcome obstacles that seem impossible. That asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom." The applause started slowly, then built into a roar. The entire auditorium stood, and David saw students and parents and teachers wiping their eyes. He saw Miguel and the other members of the grind cheering from their seats. He saw Raymond from Quick Stop, who'd taken the morning off work to attend, giving him a thumbs up. But the moment that broke him was seeing Mrs. Patterson mouth the words, "I'm proud of you." After the ceremony, David was swarmed by people wanting to congratulate him, to thank him, to share their own stories. Local news cameras had shown up, drawn by word of his speech. A reporter asked to interview him about his experience. The story aired that evening, and then something extraordinary happened. It spread. First locally, then regionally, then national news picked it up. "Student works night shifts while becoming valedictorian," the headlines read. The video of his speech went viral, shared hundreds of thousands of times across social media. David's phone exploded with messages. Some were from random strangers inspired by his story. Others were from college students offering encouragement. But the ones that meant the most were from other high school students across the country, saying, "I'm going through the same thing and you gave me hope." The owner of the Quick Stop franchise, a businessman David had never met, showed up at the store one day with news. He was creating a scholarship fund specifically for students who were working their way through school, $5,000 per year for 10 students. It would be called the David Chen Scholarship. "You've inspired me," the owner said. "You've reminded me why we need to invest in young people who are willing to work for their dreams." 5 years later, David returned to Wilson High School as a guest speaker. He was 22 now, 6 months away from graduating with a degree in mechanical engineering. He'd maintained his system throughout college, though with better sleep now that he wasn't working nights. He was being recruited by several major companies and had been accepted into a prestigious graduate program with full funding. Standing in the same auditorium where he'd given his graduation speech, David looked out at a new generation of students and saw familiar expressions. Hope, fear, exhaustion, determination. He saw kids who were struggling like he had struggled, who felt invisible like he'd felt invisible. "I'm not here to tell you it's easy," David told them. "It's not. Balancing work and school and family responsibilities is one of the hardest things you'll ever do, but I'm here to tell you it's possible. That you're stronger than you think. That the system you create, the discipline you build, the determination you develop, those things will serve you for the rest of your life." After his speech, a young girl approached him nervously. She reminded him of Miguel, of himself at that age. "I work nights at a diner," she said. "My grades are slipping. I don't know if I can keep going." David pulled out his old notebook, the one he'd carried throughout high school, now worn and creased. He'd brought it specifically for this moment. He showed her his original schedule, his grade tracking charts, his notes on time management. "This is what saved me," he said. "But you'll need to create your own version. Something that works for your life, your schedule, your challenges. And I want you to know that it gets better. Not easier necessarily, but better. You become stronger, more capable, and one day you'll stand where I'm standing and help someone else believe it's possible." The girl left with tears in her eyes and determination on her face. David watched her go, knowing she'd face countless challenges ahead, knowing some days she'd want to give up, knowing the path wouldn't be straight or simple. But he also knew she had something powerful now. Proof that someone like her could make it. Evidence that the system worked, that dedication mattered, that dreams were worth fighting for. And sometimes that's all anyone needs to keep going for one more day. The viral impact of his story. David never expected his graduation speech to leave the auditorium that day. But when someone posted the video online with the caption, "This student worked night shifts and still became valedictorian," everything changed overnight. Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed 2 million times. By the end of the week, it had reached 15 million. News outlets across the country picked up the story, wanting to interview the young man who'd defied impossible odds. David's phone buzzed constantly with messages from strangers, reporters, and organizations wanting to share his journey. The comment section became a space of raw honesty. A single mother in Texas wrote about working 3 jobs while taking night classes. A teenager in California shared that he'd been ashamed of his family's financial struggles until he saw David's speech. Teachers tagged their students, writing, "This could be you." Parents thanked David for giving their children hope. But the real impact came from the students who reached out privately. Hundreds of messages flooded David's inbox from young people across the country facing similar battles. They were working fast food jobs after school, helping parents pay rent, caring for younger siblings, all while trying to maintain their grades. David's story had given them permission to acknowledge their struggles and believe they could overcome them. A school district in Ohio invited David to speak at their graduation, then another in Michigan. Soon David was receiving speaking requests from across the nation. He started a blog documenting his time management strategies, study techniques, and mental health practices. Within months, it had 50,000 followers. The Quick Stop Owners Scholarship Fund inspired others. 3 more companies created similar programs for working students. A nonprofit organization focused on supporting first-generation college students featured David in their national campaign. His face appeared on billboards and bus stops with the tagline, "Hard work, high hopes, real results." Universities began reaching out to David, asking him to mentor their struggling students. He created online workshops teaching his organizational system, which thousands of students downloaded. High schools invited him to train their counselors on recognizing and supporting students who were working while studying. The viral attention brought challenges too. Some people accused David of bragging or making excuses for others who weren't as successful. Critics said his story promoted unhealthy work habits for teenagers. David addressed these concerns honestly in interviews, acknowledging that his situation wasn't ideal and that systemic changes were needed to support families in poverty. But the criticism was drowned out by the testimonials. Students who'd implemented David's strategies and watched their grades improve. Parents who'd learned to better support their working teenagers. Teachers who'd started checking in with their exhausted students instead of just marking them as lazy. 2 years after his speech, David received a letter from a girl named Sophie in Pennsylvania. She'd watched his video during her sophomore year while working nights at a grocery store and failing most of her classes. She'd created her own system based on his methods. Now she was graduating as salutatorian with a full scholarship to her dream school. "You saved my life," Sophie wrote, "not by giving me money or doing the work for me, but by showing me it was possible, by making me feel less alone." David kept that letter in his wallet. It reminded him why the viral attention mattered. Not for fame or recognition, but because somewhere out there another exhausted teenager was working a night shift, wondering if their dreams were worth fighting for. And now they had proof that the answer was yes. His story had become bigger than himself. It had become a movement of students refusing to let circumstances define their futures, of young people supporting each other through impossible challenges, of communities recognizing that hard work deserved recognition and support. The video might have gone viral, but the impact would last generations.